Let's get into the next step, which is API designing. Looking at the core functional requirement of the system, converting long URL to short URL. So this is this is basically a write operation when one user is trying to generate the short URL out of the long URL, and that category of the users can send those short URL to their customers. This requirement belongs to that category of the users who are generating the short URLs. By now, you would have also realized the differences between creating the URL and using the URL. So how many users would be generating the URL, writing to the system, in comparison with how many users are using the short URL to browse through or go through the original URL, which is basically a read. So as a high level number, you can think about 1:100 ratio, where one user is creating the short URL out of 100 users, and 100 users are going through the original URLs. So with that, let's start with generating the short URL. So this is basically write operation. So we must have the post API, and the post API format would look like this. This is a API for shortening the URL. Here we can provide the short URL here. So we can have short URL as a query parameter. The response for this API would be the for generating the short URL from the long URL, we must have the post API, and the structure of the post API would look like the API, and we are generating the short URL. We can pass the long URL as query parameter. For generating the short URL from the long URL, we must have the post API, and the structure of the post API would look like this, where we have the API and we are generating the short URL. So we need to pass the long URL here. So the long URL, in the request, we can pass the JSON would look like this. So here in the request, we are passing the long URL. This long URL, we can say that this is the original URL, something like this. For example, HTTP and domain name, etc. slash dot dot dot. The response of this API, which would be the short URL. Ultimately, we need the short URL from here. So here we can have in the JSON of this would be the short URL as the response, and this response can have something like HTTP colon double slash with our domain name shorten URL slash. Now how we wanted to have this short URL, the shortest possible URL, how we generate, right? So let's say for now we have some unique attributes as a query parameter from this API, and we will go through in detail what are the possible ways to generate this short URL from this long URL. But at a high level, we are trying to understand that what is the input and output of our system. Right now we are in a phase of doing it what we need, right? And as we go, we will get into the step like how we wanted to do it. So from what perspective we understand that we will need a post API, and the post API, the request and response for the post API would look like this, which would convert the long URL to short URL, and it will send back in the response that this is the short URL for that set of users. Now this URL can be shared to all the different set of users as part of their email or SMS communication, and those users or customers, when click on this URL, that will be redirected to the original URL. So now we need another API for those set of customers. So let's say these are the users, the first category of the consumers who are actually creating the short URL, and that belongs to 1 out of 100 ratio. Now for the second set of customers who are clicking on the short URL and getting redirected to the long URL, this is a read operation. So we must need the get API. The structure of the get API would look like the API slash shorten. Here we can pass as a query parameter the short URL, right? In the response of this is basically we are sending back the long URL in this case. Okay, so in this response we are sending the short URL. In this response we are sending the long URL from the past short URL. So here the response would contain the original URL, which is what we have earlier saved into our system. So we need to fetch from our system and send back this response. Also, we need to pass some kind of a status code. So in this API response, yeah, the response would return the original URL. But let's say when the customer click on this short URL in the browser, and if we are just returning this URL, we will just return the URL, right? The customer would be able to see the URL, but we do not want customer to actually get this URL and then again go and copy and paste this into the browser to go through the and visit the original URL. So for that purpose, we have something like status code here. Status code, which is the terminology for the web application. So if we send the status code as 301, so 301 status code give the instruction to the browser from the response that once the browser receives this JSON as part of calling the API, this is an instruction to the browser to redirect the request to this URL. So when customer click on this link, ultimately their request would be redirected to the original URL. So with that, customer need not to get into that level of abstraction that how the short URL and long URL conversions are happening. Customers just know about the short URL and they will be able to browse through the actual URL, which is the core functionality of the system that we wanted to achieve. So at this point of time, we have discussed so far that what is the core functionality of the system and what we wanted to achieve at a very high level. We have not yet discussed about how we wanted to implement the core functionality of the system, which is the main focus area of the interviewer. So the main core focus area, you would have realized by now that how do we convert this short URL to long URL, which is what we wanted to discuss now. You might want to discuss this at much earlier stage with the interviewer, or interviewer might stop you in between and ask you the clarifying questions. How do you wanted to convert this short to long and long to short URL conversion? What are the trade-offs you are making? How interviewer is looking for you, and also about the interviewer, how the interviewer would like you to drive. However, my suggestion here would be start with something simple that you understand, that you know about it, and then slowly get into the deep dive and getting more complexity and how you are proposing the solutions, what trade-off you are making. With that, let's start the discussion, like how are we gonna convert this short to long URL and what are the trade-offs we need to make.